Hello, I'm Daniel Monroy,
I'm Theodore Ramarak.
And I'm Pratik Ahuja.
and in this episode of Almost 107, you'll also hear, meet, and learn about
The Roots Under the Forest City, where we investigate lesser known stories and speak with people who lived through them or witnessed these experiences.
We went to three different places: the Museum London, Fanshawe Pioneer Village, and the house of the president of the Irish community in London.
I heard that you went to church. How was it?
Yes, I visited the African Methodist Episcopal Church at Pioneer Village, Fanshawe, to find out London's first black chapel. Enjoy. So we are here at the African Methodist Episcopal Church at Fanshawe Pioneer Village, and I'm here with Christina. So thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
How are you doing?
Thanks for inviting me. Great.
Yeah, great. So just the first question, what emotions or how do you feel being inside of this building? Because you know the history and the stories. So is there anything that really resonates with you?
Well, I guess first of all, every time I come into this space, I just feel very, very humbled, very grateful that we have this space and that it's been not renovated but restored to as similar as it could have been originally. And to just sit here and know the years of folks who praised here and came here for community, for solace, and the gratitude that it's been able to been saved, which is, of course, gratitude to so many people, especially over the last several years, who have worked so hard in order to get it here, where it can be enjoyed by multitudes of people. The story can be told and retold, and so yes.
So definitely. So for people who don't know, could you just explain the journey that enslaved people took to get to London and what they were kind of running away from?
Okay, well, many of the enslaved people came up through what is known as the Underground Railroad, but not all of them did. So some of them just came on their own. Most of them were escaping from enslavement in the United States, where they had been enslaved by the colonizers, by the Europeans, and were living in very harsh conditions, and so really wanted to get away. There was never an end to their work there. There was never sort of, well, I'll retire or I'll leave, because they were owned. And so they wanted to get away. And that started prior to, like in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But in 1834, the British abolished slavery in their colonies. And so Canada was a colony and became seen as a safe place. And so that was one of the big attractions for the enslaved people coming up to Canada. They were escaping from a very, very harsh reality of suffering, of being punished, of lots and lots of hard work. They did create their own communities as they could, and so there was also joy within their families, but that was limited by the space in which they were living and the work that they had to do. They were often separated from each other as families. Communities were separated. They lost their languages when they were brought over from Africa during the slave trade. And so when they knew that Canada was now a safer place, not that Canada didn't have enslaved people, because we did. We didn't have as many, and a lot of people think that Canada didn't, but we did. So when the emancipation happened in 1834, those who had been enslaved in Canada were now free. They actually some of them had been freed from earlier years. And so more and more of the enslaved people were coming up from the United States. They were originally labeled by their enslavers as fugitive slaves. But in fact, they weren't fugitives, they were people looking for freedom. So we now talk about them as freedom seekers. So they came to Canada to seek their freedom. And settled in various places. They traveled. The conditions for travel were horrible. I mean, it wasn't like they could say, "Oh, I'm going to buy a ticket on this boat and go across," right? So they traveled mostly at night, and so it was dark. They had to be very careful. They traveled along waterways because the enslavers had dogs, and they would use the dogs to chase them because the enslaved people were objects. They were owned. It was chattel slavery. So they were worth a lot of money to these enslavers. So whenever one left, they were losing money. And so they felt it was important. It was economically, for them to be able to go and bring the enslaved people back to their plantation. So some of them would create a written pass, in order to share that and say, yes, I am free. That was difficult because many of them didn't know how to read or write. And so that happened. But along the way, there were many abolitionists, many people who would protect them. They would give them a place to stay. They'd give them food. They had various ways of signage. Sometimes it was quilts that were hanging outside. Sometimes it was a song, various ways to let them know this is a safe place to go, and then move on again, when they needed to. Some places had like attics and they would store them up there. So even if the enslavers or the marshals came into the house, they wouldn't find them. And then eventually they'd get their way up to the borderline, to the lakes, and come across. So many crossed over sort of Detroit area all the way up through to Owen Sound, and then moved, inward from there. Harriet Tubman, who is known, probably one of the best known of the folks who were bringing the enslaved people up, who was known as the conductor. So the Underground Railroad, of course, wasn't a real railroad, and she was the conductor, and she helped free many of the slaves, including going back several times and, bringing her family and others. So she made several trips back and took that risk to do that, and ended up actually in St. Catharines. So that's where her family then settled when they came. But some of them came in boxes. They would be packed in a box, and then they would come across. There's stories that I've heard that some even used a coffin as a way, any way that they could to get across, get into Canada. They did, because they really were looking at Canada as the place that would give them freedom at last, because some of them were born into slavery, so they had never experienced freedom. Trapdoor, and it is believed that it's possible that when some of the freedom seekers who were perhaps being chased by the marshals wanted to take them back to the United States of America, they may have actually hidden them under these floorboards, and then there was a rug, and the pulpit sat right on top of it, so it wasn't something that people looked at.
So what was life like when those people actually got to London? What struggles did they feel, and what was their experience like after? Right.
Yeah. Well, I think that from what we know, they did have. It was a better life. They did have their freedom to choose how they were going to live. Getting jobs wasn't always easy, and they often had the jobs that other people would not take. The Europeans who were, or the descendants of the Europeans who were living here, they tended to sort of move to one area, which is where they They started out down in the Thames Street. In that area, it was called the Hollows, and it was in a floodplain, and probably one of the harshest areas in London to live, but it was what they could afford, right? And so they moved into that area together and helped each other, uplifted each other, supported each other. There were groups in the city, of course, that also helped. I'm thinking, for example, the congregation at St. Paul's Cathedral was very open to, inviting them into their space and helping to look after them. It wasn't easy to get into schools because we did have segregated schools, even though that's another thing we don't necessarily think about, that happened here. And one of the interesting things that they had to experience was in 1850, in the United States, they had what they called the Fugitive Slave Act, which then meant that they would have marshals who could come over into Canada and take the enslaved people back to the various plantations. but they didn't care who they were taking back. They didn't, specifically, so whoever they could. And so then again, they had to be hiding, they had to be careful. There were abolitionists who also came up, and it's believed that one of them may have actually been in this church speaking to the people to try and to recruit men to go back to the United States to fight in the Civil War. But they created community and supported each other, lived together. We have descendants today from some of those families, and so they helped to build London. And what it is it's what they used to help support the building, and almost, I guess, like insulation. And what's unique about it is that normally it's called lath and plaster, and the lath usually, I guess, are just strips of wood. But this is like one piece of wood that's been sort of cut and then stretched like an accordion. And so rather than have it all hidden behind the plaster, because it is unique, most churches and buildings wouldn't have had it, there's a plexiglass on it so everyone can take a look at it and really appreciate and see what it is. The floorboards were not able to be used as floorboards, but the ones that they were able to save and salvage actually are parts of the side, the wall itself.
So yeah, this church has moved around a little bit. It's had 2 different locations. Could you just say how it got to when it was first built in, I think, 1848? To how it got here to Fanshawe Pioneer Village?
Sure.
The story.
Yes. So as you said, it was built in 1848, and it served the community there for several years. And then, as happens, the community got larger. People became a little bit more affluent. They were able to buy housing in another area. So they started purchasing housing in this, what's called the Soho area. And then they built another church there, Beth Emmanuel Church. And it was a bigger church. It still stands there. And so after a few years, this building was then sold as a residential, as a home, right, for people to live in. And it was, although it's actually the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it became known as the Fugitive Slave Chapel. So you'll sometimes hear people using that, but we want to take it back to its original, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so it was a house for many years. Had siding put on it, all of walls put in, and it was, people lived in it over the years. And then in about 2013, there was a bus company that had bought a lot of the houses in that area, and they were going to demolish them to create a parking lot. And thankfully, this house, as it was at the time, had a heritage designation, which meant that it could not be demolished without special permission. And so what the bus company, the owners very generously said, look, if you want to take it, you can. We'll give it to you, basically. And so a group of very diligent folks got together and raised the funds. They had archaeologists who went and did a dig at the site to just see if there might have been anything that they could find that would represent, something different from prior to when it was a home. And it was actually then moved to Gray Street and put right beside Beth Emmanuel Church, which could be considered, some people say it was a sister church, some people say that this was the mother because it was there first. And there were lots of interesting plans that folks had for that. Unfortunately, for various reasons, it didn't happen. And so it was becoming more and more derelict over the years. And so in probably around 2020, 21-ish, COVID times are a little blurry in terms of years, the diocese of the British Methodist Episcopal Church, which is what the AME turned into, was the British, they reached out to Fanshawe Pioneer Village and they said, look, we're concerned about the church. Would you be willing to take it here? And so after, much deliberation and conversations, and the village, the board here and the executive director said, we're interested, but we need to know that this is okay with London's Black community. Long story, not so short. The building was moved here in November of 2023. the government said, we will offer X number of dollars if it's matched. So we were able to raise it, thankfully, to so many businesses, corporations, individuals who donated. And it's here, and it's been restored to as close as it could be to its natural state. Given, of course, in these times, we have to have electricity for the lighting, and there's safety rules about the stove, but it sort of looks very much like it would have then.
What I liked is it reminded us how important London's history is, and that this is really a story that has to be told. Thanks for listening. I am Daniel Monroy.
I am Pratik Ahuja.
And I'm Theodore Menroy. Find other episodes of Almost 107 on our website 1069dx.com or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.